Well, good evening and welcome everyone. I think we'll get started and perhaps a few other folks will be joining us in the next few minutes. My name is Ed Remus and I'm the Social Sciences Librarian at Northeastern Illinois University. And tonight's event is held in co-sponsorship between the NEIU Libraries and the NEIU History Department. So I'd like to begin by thanking the History Department and Professors Chuck Steinwedel and Francesca Morgan and others for being with us here tonight and helping to make this event possible. The format of our event tonight is that Dale Laackman will speak about his book, and after that we'll have some Q&A. The Q&A will proceed via chat, so please feel free to enter questions in the chat. You can do so while Dale is speaking, and you can also begin doing so during the Q&A itself. And I will pose the questions that are typed in the chat to Dale so that he can sort of address the conversation in the moment without having to monitor the chat. So please feel free to pose any and all questions in the chat, and then I will pose them to Dale. So I'd like to introduce Dale. Dale W. Laackman is an award-winning television producer, director, and writer turned historian and author whose long career includes positions at WGN-TV and Tribune Entertainment Company. He lives in suburban Chicago, and we're proud to say that he's also an alumnus of the NEIU History Department. He earned his history degree from Northeastern Illinois University in the early 2000s. And as Dale will explain, I'm sure in a few minutes, he actually got the inspiration for his book, Selling Hate, Marketing the Ku Klux Klan, from a history class at Northeastern. And so with that, let's give a warm welcome to Dale Laackman. Thank you for joining us tonight, Dale.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. This is like a homecoming, full circle back to NEIU to talk about a book that I discovered in the history department all these years ago. I want to especially thank Dr. Steinwedel, because when I just sent him an email saying that I was an alum and had written a book, he was very enthusiastic and immediately started thinking about this event. Got Ed involved almost immediately, who's equally enthusiastic about everything, and I appreciate that very much. So I want to thank also the Ronald Williams Library and also the History Department. It's a very nice event, and I look forward to telling you this story. I really want to break it into three parts. It's a national story, but I want to kind of bring a Chicago perspective to it. We can talk about the national part later with questions. But I want to bring a Chicago perspective to it. And then the second part is I really want to talk about how I discovered the story, including at Northeastern Illinois in a class. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions and we can kind of, range pretty broadly on the whole thing. I want to start by saying I did, after leaving here, taught middle school history for a number of years. And that's an adventure in itself. But one thing middle schoolers kind of embrace, maybe because of all the movies they've seen, is time travel. And I used to kind of try to use that to my advantage in teaching them some things. And one that I can remember and just kind of tell you about is when we were studying French explorers in North America, and we talked about Father Marquette and Louis Joliet. As you know, they started their famous journey from St. Ignace and were heading down the west coast of Lake Michigan, and at Green Bay discovered that they could take, I think it's the Wisconsin River, all the way to the Mississippi, and they traveled looking for a Northwest Passage. They kept going south and south and south, and I think pretty soon they were aware there was no Northwest Passage on the Mississippi, and they were also running into potentially belligerent Spaniards. So they turned back, and I think some Indians told them that there was a portage on the Chicago River. So they took that, did the short portage that they had to carry their canoes, and ended up where present-day Chicago is. So they returned, come again along the west coast of Lake Michigan, and I was in Wilmette teaching, So I would say to my middle schoolers, let's take the time machine back to September of, let me see what I make sure I have it, 1673. And we will, in the early morning, take our beach chairs out on Gilson Park Beach, and we'll just wait until a couple of canoes go past us from the left to the right. And one will be probably dressed in dark black robes. And we can wave to them, and hopefully they'll wave back. And maybe we should say bonjour, because they were probably French speakers. So they really got into that kind of a thing. So to begin this talk, I want to go again to a time machine, and it's going to be 100 years ago. Just over, or almost 100 years. It's August the 16th, 1921. And strangely enough, this story begins about 200 yards from the Ronald Williams Library. It began when people noticed a lot of commotion at the corner of Foster and Central Park. For you Northeastern Illinois people, that's pretty close, right? That's right on the southern edge of the campus. And there were literally growing numbers of people there until there were thousands, and they were all dressed in sheets and robes, and they were Klansmen. And this was late afternoon during the day. They were greeting each other. They were doing the fancy handshake that they did to show that they were Klans people. And it was quite a commotion for the people around there. And what happened eventually is a message or signal went off or something, and these people got into 2,000 waiting cars. Now, parking in Chicago, can you imagine having 2,000 cars nearby? But they did. And they started driving in a long caravan towards the north. What they were having was a great Klan initiation ceremony. People had been hearing about it for a couple of weeks. The first location they thought they were going to was just west of Evanston. And that was supported by the Evanston Klan and, get this, the Northwestern University Klan chapter. But things changed. Then the rumor was that they're headed down to the Indiana Dunes to hold this giant initiation. But they weren't going south. They were headed north. And if you guys, a lot of you know where Rand Road is, US 12. They were heading northwest on that road. And it was said that the caravan was so long that people who saw it coming watched cars go by for fully 2 hours. The road was kind of bumpy. The weather was getting a little dicey, but they were headed up towards Lake Zurich. And if you know that area at all, there's a town called Killdeer along US 12. And after they passed that point, Lake Zurich was a few miles away, but before they got to Lake Zurich, it connects with Old Rand Road, kind of just a junction. And that is where a farm was, and the cars went to a meadow on that farm. The cars formed a circle a quarter mile in diameter and turned their lights on to the middle. It was now getting dark. It was getting later. It took a long time to get up there. They put a few huge fires started. And then coming out of the cars, 10,000 Klansmen came out with lit torches, and they formed a gigantic cross inside that circle. And then next, 2,300 initiates came out, also in robes, but blindfolded and without their patches that made them formal. And then what happened, of course, was a very spectacular initiation ceremony of these people. And we know about it in a lot of ways because the Klan at this point, and I'm talking about this kind of modern marketing they were doing, were embracing publicity. So they actually invited reporters from 5 different Chicago dailies to come up to report on the story. Of course, they didn't want them to know the secret location, so they were blindfolded, and they were all in a car, and the driver got lost. And that way, you couldn't put your GPS on, you couldn't call somebody on the cell phone and say, where am I? They didn't get there till the end of the ceremony. It was over. And two of the main characters from my story, of the 3 really main characters, the Imperial Wizard Joseph Simmons was there, and also the number 2 guy, who was one of the important people in this book, Edward Clark, was there, Edward Young Clark. Clark told the reporters everything to write, so they had stories. But an interesting part of this whole thing was there was eyewitness reportage there that night. And this is a fabulous story in itself. This is maybe a book itself, but there were 2 reporters from the Chicago Defender. Anybody know what the Chicago Defender is? I'm sure you do. It's a black newspaper. They were black reporters. They had masqueraded as initiates. They had completely covered themselves, and they went through the entire initiation ceremony. And they were the only one to have an eyewitness report in the newspapers that day. I think that's really a good story. But there was another really good story, and that was the farm itself. The farm owner had allowed the Klan to come and hold their initiation there. Well, that farm was owned by a man named Charlie Wigman. Again, a lot of you are historians. Anybody know who that is? You can open your mic if you want to. Any Charlie Wigman people? Well, Charlie Wigman was a millionaire, owner of lunch counters in downtown Chicago. He had 15 to 20 lunch counters, made a lot of money. Well, he was a guy who was really into baseball. He was part of the Federal League, I believe it was called, and his team was the Chicago Whales. Lasted 2 years, folded. So what he did next was buy the Chicago Cubs and moved them to the north side and built a stadium, Wigman Field. Well, he had some financial problems, and he sold it to his friend, Philip Wrigley, who renamed the field. So I think that's a pretty cool story in itself. We're not sure that he was a Klan member, but he was certainly a Klan sympathizer. One of the things the Klan did in those days is they were very much against organized labor. And Wigman, as an owner, did not want his people to organize, so he had to pay them more. So he was probably a Klan sympathizer if he wasn't a Klan member. Okay. Now, the big thing, this is quite a spectacular thing. 10,000 people is a lot, and adding 2,300 more is a lot. 1 year earlier, there was not a single Klansman in Chicago. And that's what really a lot of this story is about, how a couple of people organized a national organization, and within a remarkably short amount of time was in every state of the Union already. Chicago is one of the greatest success stories of the Klan. It says the biggest Klan market outside of the South. I think since it's a bigger city than any city in the South, it was the biggest city organization in the country. There would eventually be 150,000 to 200,000 Klansmen in Chicago. There were most Klan groups were in small towns, so there was one Klan chapter. Well, at Chicago, they had 21 Klan chapters. And then there were many Klans in suburbs. And I have a little bit longer list, but I'll just tell you a few. Aurora, Cicero, Oak Park, Evanston, Waukegan, and even Wilmette. Also, Hyde Park was a big area in the University of Chicago. And by the way, I mentioned Northwestern having a Klan. I've done some research that show quite a few of the Big Ten universities had Klan chapters on their campuses as well at this time. In the Chicago instance, if you read the book, they said these 2 people that we're talking about in this book set up a really extensive national organization that was a well-oiled machine. The domain of the Great Lakes, which Chicago fell in, had its office on Clark Avenue at Diversey. And I'd like to say that's about a mile north of the site of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and about a mile south of Wrigley Field. They had 18 Kliegels. That's what they called salespeople. Everything in the Klan had a K in front of it. So there were 18 Kliegels there. And they made tremendous money. I have a history book that says in this period of time, the Kliegel in the United States was one of the highest paid jobs in the country. Now, having said all of that about the Klan, I'm going to read just this one-page intro of my book. And the first sentence is, this is not a Klan book. There have been many books written about the history and the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. Its violent, clandestine past is well chronicled. This is a book about selling and marketing and about public relations and about journalism. The product just happens to be the Klan. This is a story of two brilliant marketing executives who, in the early days of the 20th century, used their collective genius to spread hate across the United States. The year 1920 saw a combustible mix of socioeconomic conditions, events, and personalities that may never occur again. Edward Young Clark Jr. and Elizabeth Bessie Tyler understood their opportunity and seized it. Their reward was unbelievable treasure. Their place in history lies solidly in the halls of infamy. Their legacy is not a proud one. They could have sold any product. Instead, they chose profit over principle. Their messages and strategies were groundbreaking. The plan was all-encompassing, and the execution was seamless and decisive. This is a cautionary tale. Communication professionals have an obligation to conduct their business responsibly. Their power to persuade is considerable. The public needs to be wary of both message and motive. I am reminded of a powerful image I first saw as a young advertising major in college. Assigned reading for my Introduction to Advertising course was The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard. The cover illustration on my paperback edition showed a barbed fishhook buried in a gleaming, fresh red apple. The message was clear. So, this is a story of these two brilliant professionals who literally changed the face of America in the name of greed. For me, history is a great story filled with fascinating people, and this story has all of that. Now I want to talk about how I got to Northeastern Illinois University, sitting in a class when this was mentioned in a couple of sentences. And we have to go again to do a little bit of time traveling, because I'm going to tell you kind of the full circle that got me back there. We're going to Lincoln Elementary School Library in Zeeland, Michigan. And young Dale Laackman is about a 5th or 6th grader. And I'm looking through the shelves in my school library. I found a book. In fact, I found a lot of books. Anybody out there old enough to remember We Were There? I got the book, a sample of one of them right here. Wonderful books. In fact, there were 36 of them. I did a little research. There were 36 of them. And in every one of them, they were all about famous happenings in history. And every one of them had a young boy or girl or both in it, my age. I couldn't stop reading these things. Here's just a couple of samples. The Battle of Gettysburg. We were there at the Boston Tea Party. We were there at Pearl Harbor. We were there when Washington won at Yorktown. We were there at Appomattox with Cortez and Montezuma. On and on and on. I just could not stop reading these things, and I think that started my love of history. As we move ahead a little bit into high school, as you know, it seems like a lot of history teachers were also coaches. And I was on a lot of sports teams, and I really looked up to my coaches. So as I was getting ready to go to college, I was ready to be a coach and a history teacher. I went to a place called Hope College. Some of you probably heard of that, up in Holland, Michigan, right next to my hometown. And literally, almost all of my uncles and aunts and most of my cousins had gone there. So I went there too. And I was on my path. They train a lot of teachers there to become a teacher, but I'd always had this thing about creative writing. And I really loved the brilliantly creative advertising that you would see occasionally. And I wanted to become the world's most creative copywriter. So I transferred after 2 years and went to Michigan State. Very good advertising school there. And doing very well, ready to go to an ad agency and start a career. And in my senior year, one of the last classes I took was called Radio and TV Advertising. And the ending project was to write and produce a TV ad, and then go to the local WKAR, the university-owned TV station, and be paired with a director from the TV school and actually tape the spot. By the time that session was over, I was absolutely hooked on television production and knew exactly that's what I wanted to do. So I took about 6 months working in a furniture factory in my hometown, and then starting with the winter semester, I started a master's degree at the University of Michigan in TV and film. And I worked for 20 years in the industry as a writer and a producer director. I did news documentaries. You guys remember Soul Train? Well, my company worked on Soul Train, so I got to visit the Soul Train tapings and met Don Cornelius, which was a real trip on its own self. I worked on Cubs baseball. I worked on Big Ten basketball. I worked on a show a lot of you probably remember, The Mystery of Al Capone's Vaults. I don't know if it still is, but it had the designation of being the highest rated syndicated television special in television history. Mostly it's remembered for being kind of a flop at the end when Geraldo Rivera never found anything. But most people, if I mention my career, they go, "Oh, I remember that show." It had something like a 73 share in Chicago and a 61 rating, which is just spectacular numbers. I also got to do something historical, and with a fair amount of research, I did a show called the On Trial Lee Harvey Oswald, which was a spectacular thing to do. I was a junior high student when President Kennedy was assassinated. And when you're that age, every image you see on television is emblazoned in your head forever, seared into your brain. And when I got the assignment to do this show and to do location shooting in Dallas, I went to all of those spots, and was a terrific thing. But I was in Chicago working on a national TV show. This one was for Fox Television. It was a talk show, and it got canceled. So I was ready to start looking for a job, but I was now married. I met my wife here in Chicago, and we had 2 young boys, and she had and still does, have a fabulous corporate finance job. So the decision was made for me to stay home with the kids and become, a caregiver for them and I did that, and it was a great experience. But when they both got old enough to be in school all day long, I started thinking about returning to the history teaching dream that I had had at one point. I looked at a number of schools I needed to get another degree, and if I wanted to teach history, I had to get a degree in history. And I ended up at Northeastern, Illinois. A great decision. So I would every day I would drop my sons off at their school in Wilmette, drive up McCormick Boulevard, and usually have a class in the morning and in the afternoon. Well, one day I was in ethnic history with Dr. Reese, and I enjoyed the class tremendously. Every lecture or two he devoted to one of the ethnic groups that had come to the United States. So he did lectures on the Poles and the Italians and the Irish and on and on. Well, there was a day when he got to African Americans. And I'm looking here. I'd heard he might be here tonight, but it doesn't look like he is. So I can tell the truth. He was talking about the whole experience, and when he got to the period of time around 1915, he started talking about the new Klan, the modern Klan. And in his talk, and one thing I learned at this point is I took really good notes and I listened. And I'm glad I did that day, because he talked in 2 sentences about a man and a woman, the man named Tyler, the woman named Clark, who recruited for the Klan and had an affair. And that was it. But I almost immediately, I guess maybe because of my training in film and television, I said, that sounds like a movie. So I guess I like to tell students to kind of embrace intellectual curiosity. that if anything sounds kind of interesting in a survey history course, look it up, because you'll go to a library and that one column in your book might be 10 different books. So you can go after it. So I decided, you know, when I have some time, I'm going to look into that a bit. And one day, I was there for lunch every day because I had a morning class and an afternoon class. I went over to the Ronald Williams Library and started doing some research. And there wasn't much there. First thing I found out, and you know, don't tell Dr. Reese this, he had the last names switched. It was a woman named Tyler and a man named Clark. It was Elizabeth Bessie Tyler and Edward Y. Clark Jr. And the more I learned about these people, it was not two people in a car driving across America, stopping town by town and recruiting people. Because when I first heard the story, I thought of like Paper Moon, if you remember that movie with Ryan and Tatum O'Neal, where they're selling Bibles town to town. And I thought of The Music Man, because again, that Harold Hill was going town to town selling band instruments, and they were both con artists in both of these stories. And I thought that's the kind of story this was. This was not two people in a car driving town to town. This were people in Atlanta who went national and enormous. And the more I found out about it, the more spectacular it was. I did write it as a screenplay first, because I just, that's the way I was trained. I thought in dialogue and I thought in scenes. So I ended up with about 150-page screenplay that I tried pitching for quite a while. I finally got it through a contact, a friend of mine who had a friend who had a friend, to a big-time producer on the West Coast. And I got feedback, and the person said, great story, really well written, but it's a book. And I kind of understand that. Movies are expensive, and the Klan is kind of a tough subject matter to get much box office in, so you don't see many movies about the Klan. So maybe that was his feeling, it was a book. But I had to really take stock as to whether I could even write a book. I'd never written a book. And I really had to think that my research had to be incredibly deeper, because I did not know much about these people. I was able to create scenes for them and dialogue for them in a screenplay, but I didn't know much about them, because Bessie was a dirt poor, uneducated woman. And there's really nothing written about her early part of her life. Edward was, they're very different people. Edward was a son of a man who owned the Atlanta Constitution. He came from a whole different background, better, educated, wealthy, but guy didn't like to work very hard and liked to cheat people. But so just finding out about these people was a real problem. And of course, the problem with Bessie, I just want to share this in terms of research, is that if you don't know a woman's maiden name, you got a problem finding out who she is. And I'd read in the story, in some of the research I got, that Bessie, at the end of the story, moves to Altadena, California. And so I said, oh, I'm gonna, and I know that she died quite early after that. She died at a young age. So I called the Altadena Library, and I was telling Ed this before we got here this morning, or this afternoon, this evening, that one of the heroes of this story are research librarians, because I did this entire book without leaving my study where my computer was. We can do that with the internet now, and we can do that with cell phones that have unlimited long distance capability. So I would call a research librarian, and my opinion is they're probably just sitting at their desk waiting to do something and wanting to do some research. And that's what I found. Their enthusiasm was tremendous. And with digital things now, a lot of the materials digitized with email. I could ask a question at 10 in the morning, and at 2 in the afternoon, I got an email with tons of material, original primary kind of stuff. But I talked to this librarian in Altadena, and she said, you know, let me take a look at findagrave.com. And she came back and she gave me the full name on her grave, which included the maiden name. And she was married a lot of times, so there were a lot of names on it. But that got me into her. I was able to look up records, census records, and start kind of piecing her together. So the research was fun. I learned that I absolutely loved research. There are some pieces that I found almost by accident. You're heading down a hallway one direction and you turn the corner and something totally unexpected is there. And generally, in this case, something had never been published before. So there's a lot of material in the book that is really brand new. So I'd like to stop right there because hopefully after you hearing that, you've got a lot of questions. So I would love to answer every question that you have if I can.
And so with that, I would encourage attendees to type questions in the chat. And as you type questions in the chat and pose them, I'll go ahead then and read them aloud to Dale, who can answer them. And so please feel free to type questions that have arisen in your minds. We have a lot of time left for Q&A. I think I'll kick things off with a librarian type of question. I'm curious, Dale, if in the course of your research, you happen to have encountered a brick and mortar archive, a collection of archival holdings that you would visit if you could. If you were to carry this research further, is there something that would take you beyond, beyond the computer desk in the office that you would love to be able to dig into in terms of a primary source?
Well, I can answer two things there. Bessie is really dirt poor, and the thing is, in a talk like this, I don't want to give too much of the story because I'd love to have you discover the story if you're interested in it in the book. But Bessie was very poor, married 4 times. And when she started making huge amounts of money, one of the first things she wanted to do, as I think a lot of poor people in the South who get wealthy would do, is to build a mansion, in a sense, looking like Tara from Gone with the Wind. It is a mansion. It's still there. It's on the Registry of Historic Places. And I visited it. That was pretty cool. That's the only time I went down to Atlanta. And I was invited by some people to talk about what I was working on. So that was great. I learned all about that because the people who owned the house had made it a historic place. And as a result, there's a trove of material you have to provide to get that designation. And the guy at the registry sent me the whole thing. And it was including floor plans and all kinds of things. It is a spectacular home. The woman who owned it was like 77 years old and had lived in that house for 70 of those years. I think she was away in college and then got married and was away for a couple of years, but had lived there almost the entire time and kept it in fabulous shape. And in fact, shortly after I was there, they put it on the market. And I think it sold for $3.5 million in Atlanta. So quite a house. The other thing is kind of a trove, is that I had heard the name J.Q. Jett. Turns out he was the son-in-law of Bessie. Just to flash back again, Bessie was first married when she was 15 and had a daughter a couple of months later and was divorced within a year of that. That was her first marriage. But that daughter had married this man, J.Q. Jett. And he's very key in this story too. But he corresponded. There was not much correspondence with these people, but he corresponded with both Bessie and Edward. And they had these letters were put together and called the J.Q. Jett Papers, and they ended up in the Hargret Rare Book and Publication Library at the University of Georgia. I didn't go there because I hired one of the people that worked there to do some research for me, far less expensive than a plane ticket and all of that. So that turned out that I don't believe any of that had ever gotten out of a shoebox in those archives, and now they're in this book. There was another thing, there's a really fascinating character that usually was mentioned in less than a sentence almost as a whistleblower, to these people. And his name was Henry Peck Fry. He had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute. And I contacted their librarian in their archives. And she said, we got a file on him. And in it was even a typewritten resume that he had sent later in life to her. And when I read that, it made a whole lot of sense on a lot of his involvement in the story. And even his obituary when he died also provided a whole lot of information that, again, had never been talked about more than, generally they said Henry Peck Fry was a whistleblower against the Klan. So he became a really key character in this. So I guess that's the way I can answer those two things. But generally, I didn't find any huge amount of anything on them. It was just bits and pieces, because I talk in the book about these were people that didn't write themselves, and few people wrote about them. So there's not a lot about their personal lives. Had to really piece it together. I talk in there about especially Bessie being like a rummage sale jigsaw puzzle with some parts missing. So I hope that answered something.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So we've got another question. Could you please tell us about the PR work done by the Klan? How specifically was the PR work done? What did they do specifically? And what was unique about the Klan's advertising and marketing tactics during this period?
Well, that's a big question. I did not take PR courses, but I know enough about PR that they basically put together a modern, highly sophisticated PR program. They took a Klan shrouded in secrecy, and that's one of the reasons why they were failing, because nobody knew about them, and shed light on them, made them legit, gave them a face, gave them an office, gave them all kinds of things. They put together mass mailings, newsletters. They did a lot of crisis management. They did just about everything that's probably studied in a PR course. And these people, one of the key pieces of research was a book by a guy named Scott Cutlip. Does anybody know him? Is there anybody here from the PR department or marketing? Scott Cutlip was a real pioneer in public relations. I think he was head of department at University of Wisconsin, then of Georgia. And he put out a book on the history of PR, and he had case studies of various people, lots of them. He did devote some time to Clark and Tyler. And he essentially says that they were absolutely brilliant and groundbreaking, that they were pioneers. And he does say, however, they used their gifts and their talents in all the wrong ways. So he wanted to talk about them, but he wanted to say that morally they were a real problem for the industry. I mean, again, I'm kind of flying around here, but at some point, the New York World gets to a point where they want to do an expose on these people because the Klan's growing so much in New York City even. So they do 23 pages or 23 days of front page coverage, and they won the first Nobel or the first Pulitzer Prize in investigative journalism as part of it. But even as these articles are coming out, Edward and Bessie are trying to figure out how to do crisis management, and what they do is kind of brilliant. And also, to see how wide-ranging this program is, after this incredible investigative series, there are clamors for the government to get involved, and there are hearings in the U.S. House of Representatives about them. And again, a lot of bad materials coming out about them, a lot of negative. So again, they're doing crisis management in another very creative way. They put out a newspaper. They just went on and on with ways to communicate in a time when there really wasn't any radio or television. There were pretty much print and newspaper was their main vehicle.
So we've got another question here. Could you please describe the eclipse of that Klan in the mid 29s and the end of its mass appeal phase. What, if anything, went wrong with the PR and sales networks, and probably I would add also the crisis management techniques that you're describing amidst the Klan scandals?
Thanks a lot.
Is that Dr. Morgan's question?
Yeah, that's mine.
Yeah, I think it's 1924. I think it's 1924 when the giant parade goes down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. That's everybody's seen that. That's taken an American history course. When it gets to the 1920s, there's always something about the Klan, and there's always that picture. You've all seen it. But 1925 is kind of the high water mark when they get to between 4 and 6 million. And they even had a women's Klan going for a while there. But pretty much what happened was a series of scandals from the leadership of the Klan, financial and sexual. There was a lot of money being taken under the table by leadership. But the biggest one was D.C. Stevenson in Indiana. Some of you may have heard about this guy. He was probably maybe the second or third most powerful person in the Klan. He was Indiana, but he also had charge of many states around there. And he turned Indiana into his own kingdom, basically. He had the governor, was a Klansman. He had a number of legislators in the House and the Senate there. And he kind of felt like he was a guy you couldn't touch. But the mistake he made is that he had a woman, I believe that she worked for him, named Madge Overholser, and he took her across state lines and raped her and brutally murdered, or didn't murder her, left her near death. And he and a couple of his aides transported her back and dropped her at the door of her mother and father's house. And eventually she, a couple of days later, committed suicide. And this became one of the biggest stories in America, front page, for months and months and months, and really did a great deal of damage to the Klan. He was finally found guilty, but he felt pretty cocky in that he felt that the governor and all the people he had in place would let him out. They didn't. And angrily, he exposed lots of other people, and the Klan really couldn't live that down. So the membership receded throughout the last 5 years of that decade, and then the Depression hit, and buying membership dues and paraphernalia and things like that became difficult for people, so it just continued down. I did talk to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and this was back when I was writing the book, and they estimated there were only about 5,000 Klans people in the United States. And where Bessie and Edward's Klan was centrally run, none of these people talk to each other, and the Klans are probably 10 to 15, 20 people each. So the Klan itself is not much of a factor at all. The Southern Poverty Law Center does something called Klan Watch, at least they used to, where you could actually indicate around the country where they all were. And there are some in the Chicago area still, but you never hear about them, and they really don't do very much. Every once in a while you hear about a rock or a brick wrapped with a piece of paper around it, thrown into a driveway, trying to recruit people. So that happens occasionally. So does that answer your question, Dr. Morgan?
Yes, thanks a lot. I appreciate the overview. I was just curious about it in light of public relations,
Yeah. And I think another interesting thing, I have a son who thinks a lot about these things, but he really gave me the theory, and I think it's a good one, that it's not very cool to be in the Klan now. It was back then. But now, with the internet, I think that hate can be really anonymous and really nasty. And that has kind of taken over, being in a robe. So there really isn't much of it anymore.
Well, that sort of opens on to the next question we have here in the chat, and so I'll read it. I have not read the book yet, but I will purchase it after this. The reason the lecture interested me is because I was the equal opportunity person in my old military unit. I took a week-long class on equal opportunity in Springfield in 2013. There are lists of white supremacist organizations, the Klan, and many more, such as the Proud Boys and everything in between. This was in 2013, and it's only recently made the big media. I'm wondering why there is such denial of the current and even past membership in these domestic terror organizations when they have been so widespread and even generational. I know this is not the specific subject of your book, but you maybe will know something about spreading awareness or getting people to recognize the real threat.
Oh, it's a good question. Now, one thing about your Proud Boys and people like that, and if you remember the Charlottesville incident, there was no effort to mask themselves. You know, and in an era now where everybody's got cell phones to take photos, it was surprising. I remember the footage from Charlottesville that I think was it Vice TV or whatever it put on of these young men marching and chanting in the night in Charlottesville, and they were clean cut looking guys, and made no effort to hide their identity. But it has been out there. I mean, right now it's unfortunately it's a huge topic right now that hate groups are almost being embraced politically. So I'm not sure how to answer it in any other way than that, but I'm really surprised at how pervasive and how big a part of the news cycle right now hate groups are. It kind of shows you that racism never really goes away. John Meacham wrote a book, I think it was Soul of America, recently, where he kind of goes into this, where he says that racism is always just a couple of inches below the surface of America, and that occasionally it rises its head, and until somebody can kind of suppress it again. And I think that's really true. It's cyclical. There have been a lot of populist movements throughout American history, and I think populism was kind of the Klan back in the early 20s. Instead of a person that was the populist, it was the organization. But usually it's a person who kind of says, I'll take care of all your problems. Don't want to get too political, but I do remember the one statement by President Trump when he was nominated, and he was giving his nomination speech back in 2016. And I think he said, only I alone can help you. And that just kind of, when I heard that kind of rang true of populism. So
Professor Steinwedel asks, those of us who are not US historians often think of the KKK as a secret organization. So the very public nature of the event you described at the start of the talk is fascinating and disturbing. How extensively was the KKK covered in the Chicago press? Was coverage in some papers more helpful in your research than others?
I don't know how much coverage there was in the Chicago press. But like I said before, Bessie and Edward embraced the publicity. They wanted it. And they tried very hard to make sure that it was good publicity. They would I've seen a picture in the Grand Rapids Press of a picnic in the 20s in Jackson, Michigan, with nearly 100,000 people at it. And many of them were children and women. They wanted as positive a spin on it as possible. They talked about being great Americans. They talked about protecting the womanhood. They talked about being against against lawlessness. They would say they would help the police. They really wanted to be a light shown on them in a way, and they wanted to have a lot of positivity to it because they knew that there was a huge number of people out there who were fearful and wanted somebody to protect them, and they wanted the Klan to do that. I talk about the bottom line of their entire marketing plan was based on white Protestant fear. And I talk a lot about right after, I spent a really long chapter called Fertile Ground, right after World War I. I don't know that this story would have happened 5 years earlier or 5 years later. You know, sometimes timing is everything in history. It's going to happen at one point, but it may not happen at another. After World War I, it was absolutely ripe for it. You know, I learned a lot about the Red Summer of 1919 as part of it as well, where there were black and white riots across the country, 25 or 30 cities, and it scared everything out of white people. And because of that fear, the Klan would go, here I'm telling the whole story again, but they didn't just market anti-black. They knew because of the timing after World War I, they had a much bigger market. The Great Migration had taken blacks north, so there were significant black populations in northern cities taking people's jobs, or taking jobs away from whites potentially. There were World War I, immigration was down to nothing because of U-boat warfare, and there were no immigrants. The war ended, and they flowed in, and they were generally not English speaking, and they were not Protestant, they were Catholic. And there's a lot of anti-Catholicism in America at that point, so they jumped on that. So they had this expansive market that they found, and they wanted their image as a Klan to be protectors for people, that they would go to whatever city and they would find out in that city what the Protestants were afraid of. And it might have been in California, Chinese and Japanese. It might have been in New Mexico, Hispanics and Native Americans. It just depended on where, and they told their salespeople to go to a town and just kind of hang around for a week and talk to people and find out what they're thinking about. And then they would say, well, the Klan's here to help you with it. We can help you. And people signed up by droves. So you get a couple of the key people in the town, and then everybody joined. So that was their PR and marketing plan.
Professor Christina Bueno asks, could you please say something about KKK chapters on university campuses? When did these campus chapters start and end? How were they formed?
Well, I don't know a tremendous amount about it. I did get a number of newspaper articles from the time, but I suspect they started just like all the others in 1921, because one thing you do, if you do a Google search of every state in the Union and you search Oregon, Klan history in Oregon, you will find 1921 and a lot of stories about them. I suspect the Big Ten campuses started in 1921 as well. And I mean, you had Hampshire and Maine and Iowa and Michigan, and every state you would imagine there would never be a Klan chapter, and had Klan chapters at this time. And it's really a remarkable thing. You don't like what Clark and Tyler did, but they certainly were successful, monumentally successful doing it. So I don't know a lot about when those Klans were on Big Ten campuses. But there could be students there that came from households that were pretty racist, and they learned their racism there. And when they went to campus, it was still there. And if the Klan was organizing, they were probably going to jump into it and be a part of it.
Professor Morgan in the chat has written that in the 1920s, the KKK spread hatred for Jews as well as some of the other groups you mentioned. And
absolutely.
Talk a little bit about that. What was...
Well, many things to say about that, but as an aspect of being anti-immigration.
Right. But anti-Semitism is still, involved heavily with the hate groups, just as it was then. Excuse me. I go through, like I say, this Fertile Ground chapter. I go right through it. I even blame Henry VIII for anti-Catholicism. So you'll be interested in seeing how I got there. But there have been a lot of anti-religion riots in American history throughout the 1700s and 1800s.
So I want to encourage others to, again, feel free to type any questions in the chat that you'd like to have addressed. I've got one more question for you, Dale. If you could imagine an ideal reader or type of reader for your book, someone who you think maybe wouldn't necessarily encounter it otherwise, but you would like to have them encounter your book and the message of it, who would that reader or type of reader be, and what would you want them to take away from reading your book? How would you want it to change their mind or make them think about something differently?
Well, one problem is just to get them to read it. A Klan story may scare them a bit, or they may not think they have interest in it, but this is a incredibly interesting story. So I think it is a kind of a book that a general history reader would really enjoy if they could just get exposed to it. The other market I see, and I hope it happens, is that I see this as a part of a reading list for college classes in marketing, PR, and journalism, because it's really, I think, important, untold history of those disciplines in the early 20th century. And I also think it's great on a reading list for those classes as an ethics lesson. It's a case history, because these people ethically really had a problem. It's interesting. I'll tell a story here. I was planning on telling anyway. I was once invited not long ago to a Unitarian church to speak. And I don't know how they got my name, but they asked, it's a church, Unitarian, this particular Unitarian church has no minister. They just meet and they have guest speakers every week as their sermon. So I figured, how am I going to write this story or tell about this story to this group? And I figured the misuse of gifts. A lot of Christianity is based in the gifts that you've been given, and that they misuse these gifts. And I told the whole story. And in fact, J.Q. Jett, the son-in-law, is really key to this story, because he's the one that turns them on to this client. He worked for Bessie and Edward. They were really successful, but then their business at the end of the teens had a lot of problems, and they had lost clients. They were really scratching. And JQ, as many people you'll see in this book, fraternal societies are really amazingly important in this. Loved fraternal societies with costumes and rituals and all that kind of stuff. And one of the last things that Simmons, the original founder and the eventual Grand Wizard, he had run out of money by 1919. His Klan that he had started in 1915 was down to a couple thousand guys. They were completely out of control. He was out of money. He had mortgaged his house. He was just about dead. I mean, the Klan would have died. And with his last couple of bucks, he bought a ad in I think either the Atlanta Journal or the Atlanta Constitution of even hand drew a Klansman atop a rearing horse with the costume and the sword and all that kind of stuff. And JQ saw that, and he liked uniforms and things, so he actually signed up. He got to know Simmons, listened to him speak a few times, and he went back to Bessie, his mother-in-law, and Edward. And he said, we can really do something for these people. We do this kind of thing well. They did membership drives for the YMCA and for all kinds of the Red Cross, things like that in Atlanta. They're really good at it. And I was talking about this whole thing, and I said, and these people, I guess I was doing okay because they were really listening. And I said at the end of the talk, and again, middle school kids like saying "what if" a lot. You'll tell them about a story in history, and they say, "Well, what if?" Which I've learned is called counterfactual history. And one little thing could have happened that changes history entirely. There's a book called "What If," and I remember the very first story is about George Washington after the first battle against the British on Brooklyn Heights. He's trying to escape back into Manhattan. He's cornered. They're badly beaten, and the next day they're going to be all taken captive, and the war's going to be over. Well, an amazingly heavy fog rolled over the Hudson, and Washington was able to put some fake bonfires up and got his entire army out of there and survived. That's a what if. What if that fog hadn't come? Well, in this case, I kind of said, well, what if when JQ went to Bessie and Edward and said, we can do something for him. This could be really tremendous. And I said, what if Bessie and Edward just said, and about 5 people in the audience said, no, before I could even say it. So it's an interesting thing in terms of how you use your gifts and, you know, what your motives are. If your motive is purely money and it's not keeping in line with the law or anything like that, these people, I like to say, actually changed the face of America during the 20s. The Klan was huge. They were even influencing national presidential elections in 1924. That's how big they had gotten. So I don't know if I answered that question properly, but.
Yeah, thank you. Our Dean of Library, Stephen Harris, asks, speaking of your book, how did you get your manuscript accepted by the University of Georgia Press? What was the story of how you connected with that press and got the book published?
Well, I knew I would get the question of how to get published. It's really hard. It's hard if you have never written before, you know, have never published, and you're not a famous person. General presses are almost impossible. I understand there are only about 5 main presses. They each have probably 25 imprints or more, but there are very few. None of them will ever accept a manuscript without an agent. They won't even talk to you. And if you've never written before, you can't get an agent. So it's a real catch-22, very hard. And I was pitching it all over the place, but I found university presses much more acceptable. They did not require agents. And the great thing about it, you look on their webpage and you'll see the acquisition editors listed, and under each one is their specialty, and each of them has an email. So I did an awful lot of work finding the history and African-American studies and all that, acquisitions editor, and just pitching and pitching and pitching. I had interest by a number of university presses. Georgia, I always thought was the natural one because the story took place there. I think it's also a pretty well-respected press. And so they accepted it. I also had the University of Alabama and the University of Missouri and Michigan State. A number of them were interested at some point, but it was hard work, really hard work to get published.
Well, I think that concludes our Q&A unless anyone else has a last minute question to type in the chat. Feel free to do so. But I will go ahead once again and paste the University of Georgia Press discount code in the chat in case some of you came late before I was able to give that at the outset of the event. And I'm also listing there in the chat the specific webpage where you can purchase the book from the University of Georgia Press. So with that, I want to draw our event to a close by once again thanking the History Department and all others on campus who have supported the event. And of course, thank you, Dale, for being with us here tonight. We learned a lot from this event, and we appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. I wanted to say that the book is also available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And there's a paperback, an audiobook, and an ebook. I've actually just been listening to my audiobook. It's kind of cool. It didn't come out until February. And it's kind of interesting to hear a professional reader read your words. So I've been commuting to work and back listening to the book this week. Also, you know, if you don't mind, spread the word. University presses don't have giant marketing budgets, so any help, you know, anything. If you know people in communication studies that might be interested in using the book educationally, I think that would be a great thing as well. But I certainly appreciate this. I hope you found the book interesting. Hope a few of you might read it. And if you like it, recommend it to others, write a review on Amazon or places like that. It all helps to get the word out about the book. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.